Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2025 Hot Topics in Environmental Law Summer Lecture Series. I'm Christophe Courchaine, Faculty Director of the Environmental Law Center and Associate Dean for Environmental and Experiential Programs here at Vermont Law and Graduate School. Each of these talks is worth one Vermont CLE credit, so please keep track of those talks that you attend for your records. We'll have time after the presentation today for Q&A. For those of you who are watching live on VLGS YouTube, please enter your questions in the chat space that's along the right-hand side of the page at any time during the talk, and we'll get through as many of your questions as we can. Today, we're honored to welcome Josh Eagle. Josh Eagle is a professor of law at the University of South Carolina School of Law and is affiliated both with the school's Marine Sciences program and its School of Earth, Ocean, and Environment. He teaches courses in property law, environmental law, natural resources law, and ocean and coastal law. Professor Eagle has authored and co-authored more than 20 law review articles, peer-reviewed articles, and book chapters, and he's the author of the Aspen case book, Coastal Law. Professor Eagle has an illustrious career testifying before Congress, the White House Ocean Policy Task Force on legal issues related to ocean zoning and the siting of offshore energy facilities. Currently serves on the National Academy of Sciences National Research Council Committee created by Congress to study the environmental and economic impacts of the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill. He's a member of the South Carolina Blue Ribbon Committee on Shoreline Management. And before joining the faculty at the University of South Carolina, Professor Eagle helped found and lead Stanford University's Fisheries Policy Project, an interdisciplinary research project linking Stanford Law School and Stanford's Hopkins Marine Station. Previously, Professor Eagle was a wildlife counsel in the Policy Office, the National Audubon Society, and a trial attorney with the U.S. DOJ. He received his JD from Georgetown University Law Center, Master's of Sciences in Forest Sciences from Colorado State University, and a BA from Johns Hopkins University. Professor Eagle joins us here at VLGS this summer as the instructor for Ocean and Coastal Law, always popular offering here in the summer. Please join me in welcoming Josh Eagle. Take it away.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that very kind introduction. And, this talk, it combines two of my big interests, one in public lands law, which is how when I was at Colorado State studying forestry, it's how I kind of got into environmental law in the first place. And then also my interest in coastal law and specifically in beach access law, which is an area I've been focusing on for the past, 8 to 10 years. And I was asked to do this talk, and originally the title that I proposed was something like public access to beaches and other public lands, past, present, and future. But then I realized, well, I think if we're going to call it hot topics, I should talk more about hot topics and less about my research these days, which is focused on use of beaches in medieval England. Not really a hot topic. It's very interesting to me and very relevant I think, to the topic of beach access. But it occurred to me there are a lot of interesting things going on, a lot of cases going on, and developments going on in public access to public lands and beaches included, that are changing due to technology. And of course, everything is changing due to technology. I'm probably not the best person or the most knowledgeable person to do this kind of thing, just simply because of my age and I'm not from the current generation. My son probably would do a better job on this talk, being more familiar with modern technology. But what I'm hoping to do is kind of give you a sense of how I think the world of recreation on public lands is changing, some of the forces that are driving that, and then we can think about some of the legal issues that might arise due to those changes, or some of the issues we might want to be thinking about now. So I welcome any interjections or comments that you might have. Because of the way the screen's up, I don't have the chat visible, but I guess maybe I'll see a raised hand if it pops up on my screen, but I will save, hoping to talk till about 12:35, 12:40. and then we'll have whatever time you all need to answer any questions. Okay, well, let's get started with that. So obviously this is, well, obviously not obviously, this is a picture just of an e-mountain bike. We'll talk a little bit about them in the talk, raising all kinds of interesting questions. Are they bikes? Are they motorcycles? Certain public lands are going to allow non-motorized recreation. Of course, mountain bikes have always been controversial in, say, wilderness area use. But there are other features or other implications of e-bikes that I'll talk about. Before we get started, let's see if this works here. Oh, well, I'll talk about some of the, I thought I had a little video, but maybe it's in my next couple slides. And I apologize also, by the way, if I seem a little harried, it's because I'm teaching 39 hours of class in 2 weeks, or 3 weeks. So my brain, I just had 3 hours this morning, so my brain is a little bit off. So some of the things that technology does, some of the enhancements, let's say, that technology adds to the world of public access, positive or negative. Geolocation, or the ability to figure out where I am as a recreator, or where recreators are if I'm a landowner or a government official. So much significant enhancements in those things in just the last couple of years. Mobility, that's where I mentioned e-bikes, and you'll see there are lots of other forms now of mobility, and these are challenging, could be challenging. They certainly provide a lot of opportunities that weren't there for people to explore, who maybe weren't able to get to places before. And also then that enhanced mobility leads to the possibility of enhanced conflict with landowners or the government, because obviously people are going places that we aren't used to monitoring necessarily, or we have difficulty enforcing rules. So location, mobility, enforcement. I'll give a couple examples of this, but certainly our ability to detect, for example, trespassing, to police large areas of land and water. As you'll see, actually, to measure altitudes matters a lot in real-time measurement of altitude matters a lot in beach property enforcement. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about how technology has changed ownership and the ways that that might increase access opportunities, but also, again, increase the possibility of conflict between landowners and the public. So I just summarized some of the impacts of those enhancements: more access, possibly for people, for more people to get to more places and more remote places. More conflicts, again, when you have more people going to more places and more remote places, there's a possibility of increased conflict with landowners. It could be that there's less access because of the enforcement tools that I mentioned. So areas that before there may be a question, this is certainly true of the beach, whether certain areas are public or private, it's unknown now, at least in the world before technology. And so recreation could occur there simply because the property rights weren't clear. But to the extent that we now have better ways of measuring things and also monitoring things, it could result in kind of a tighter control of public use. And then maybe fewer conflicts to the extent that we do clarify property entitlements. That's possible. Or we might have people going to places that where there are fewer possibilities of conflict occurring. Okay, so that's really what I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to give you lots of examples. I guess I lost my video. That's okay. Maybe my video, you know where it was. Well, anyway, let's see. I'm going to try because I think it's worth it. Maybe was it before that? Yes, it is. Let's see if this link works. No, doesn't. Okay. Well, what I was going to show you on the video was something that I just thought was funny. There are now VR products for VR hiking, where you essentially, I've never done this myself, but the video is a video of someone experiencing something called the 10 waterfalls hikes. And you'll see it's meant to be in 8K. I think the quality depends on the quality of your internet connection. I tried it at home, or my place I'm renting this morning, and it turned out to be not so breathtaking as it might otherwise have been. But whether that counts as a possibility for public access or not, I'm not really sure whether that will take away from people actually visiting places when they can experience these places, maybe in the sanctity of their own home. You wouldn't get the smell, maybe, but you do get the sound and the visuals. And also, I guess you may not have the same freedom to explore. I'm not sure. I've never tried that. Okay, well, let's talk about this first slide here. This is a picture of a beach. It's actually, if you can read my video or my picture is blocking some of it, but this is on the Pacific Ocean. So you would have the ocean would be on the left. People from the Pacific states tend to put the ocean on the left. People from the Atlantic states like me, I usually put the ocean on the right, but that's okay. And essentially what we have here are a number of elevation contours on a beach. And you can see the dark line, that's the sea level contour, 0 meters above sea level, the 1 meter contour, et cetera, et cetera. And I guess a couple points to make. One would be, obviously, these are very irregular lines. They're not straight lines. They follow elevation, like as you would say with a topographic map. And these lines obviously wouldn't be on the beach so that you could see them while you were walking on the beach. In a world where most of us exist, most of the beaches we go to, the case would be that areas that are somewhere on the left, well, certainly the ocean, and then up to some point in the middle of the beach, that would be public property that you would be entitled to use as a member of the public. And then somewhere to the right of this picture would be the private property that belongs to, say, a beachfront homeowner, landowner. And so there's always been a question about where exactly that line dividing those two property owners is, the line between public and private property. As students in my class know, in most states, the location of the line, the boundary between those two properties, is determined by measuring the average height of high tides over an 18.6 year period, which produces, that calculation produces something called the mean high tide plane. And that plane is then projected into the beach. So let's say it was, we can just use these contour lines. Let's say the average height of high tides was, over that period was 1 meter above sea level. Then that dashed line in the middle there, the 1 meter contour, that would be the property boundary. Now, before technology, it's always possible, it was always possible, or at least kind of possible, to get a surveyor out to the property to measure and to figure out where that line was, and they could mark it off. And that's all fine and good. But as we know, or you probably can guess, right? The beach is constantly changing shape and elevation. That's part of the nature of a beach, not just due to storms and things like that, but just even on a day-to-day basis, particularly if the beach is a shallow slope beach like we have a lot on the eastern Gulf Coast. It's typical for that 1 meter contour, say, to move 30 to 50 feet every night, depending on how the sand has been moved around by the tides or currents or wind or something like that. So even if we had a surveyor out today, that wouldn't give us much of a clue where the line would be tomorrow. And so, as I've noted in the past and some of my work, that means that as a practical matter, it's very difficult, if not impossible, for landowners to bring criminal trespass or to enlist the police to arrest people. Police would not have probable cause to believe that someone knew where that line was at that particular moment in time and crossed it intentionally. It's very difficult to know in real time where the line is. Of course, the technology today, and I remember even a paper I think I wrote maybe 8 years ago, I talked to the Google Map department and was trying to find out sort of where they were in the world of real-time altitude calculation, and at that time they weren't anywhere close to that. I think now the technology, there are apps that can tell you about where exactly, how many feet you are above sea level. Now, if I knew that as a landowner, if I could figure out every day and every minute where that line was, it's going to make it a lot easier for me to keep people off the beach. If I'm a conscientious beachgoer, it would make it a lot easier for me to avoid trespassing if that's what I wanted to do. Now, of course, in some states, there's more complication here, but there would be other justifications, legal justifications for someone to be on the landowner's property, at least on the beach part. But this is an example of where technology is going to reduce probably the amount of public access to a beach. And this is just an app I pulled up this morning called My Altitude, and you can see it's actually based on all kinds of things, including barometric pressure. I didn't get into all of the science. It says coordinates, barometric pressure, the boiling point of water, which I don't know how they figure that out through an app, but obviously that can give you an indication of altitude as well. So anyway, but these are apps that are currently available and would make it easier for the police and for a private landowner to stop someone from being too high up, too close to their house. I mentioned e-bikes. This is a picture of a place called Kiowa Island in the state where I currently live in South Carolina. And if you look at the map, you'll see Kiowa Island is a pretty big island. It's connected to Seabrook Island, kind of down there on the southwest corner. But the way you get to Kiowa Island is you can see that road. Let's see, maybe I can, I don't know if you can see can you see my cursor? Yeah, okay. There's a road that comes in here. And then that road comes here. And the first place you get to is something called Kiowa Beach Walker Park. And that's a public beach park. That was a requirement. The developers were required to put that in. This is all privately owned, was built by one developer and then sold a few times. But they were required to put in this public access when they built the property. There's some parking there, not that much, maybe 100 spaces. And what happens, there's a path that goes from the beach, from the parking lot, excuse me, down to the beach. And for the most part, if you go down there, that parking lot fills up very quickly. But if you're able to get a parking spot and go down to the beach, you'll find that most people who park there go to this part of the beach right here. And because it's a public access, the dry sand part is publicly owned, was dedicated to the public. And then, of course, the wet sand all the way along this island, the part that's below mean high tide, or like in the picture I showed before, below 1 meter elevation, if that's the right number. That area is all owned by the state of South Carolina in public trust status, and so that's open to the public. And so what I wanted to kind of point out was, the crowding is pretty much here. Now, if as a legal matter, if I really wanted to, I could bring a bike to this park and I could ride up the beach somewhere and go to some of these other beaches. That creates the possibility of conflict because up here, we've got that dual ownership of the beach problem where the upper beach is private and the lower beach is public, and we have to find the line, et cetera, et cetera. But from here, this area, as you go out further and further along the island until you get to way out here, the houses get more and more expensive because they're more and more isolated or further away from the public. That's part of it. And they're also sort of bigger lots and those kinds of things to where you get to the, $10 to $20 million houses out here, more like $1 million to $2 to $4 million in here, and then, somewhere around $1 million in here. And so, the idea of e-bikes that have these incredible ranges and the big tires and those kinds of things, make it so that it'll be very easy for people to suddenly ride on the wet sand beach all the way out here. And I think that's going to cause some potential conflicts, whether we're going to have rules on whether e-bikes can be used on the beach or not. I'm not sure. Are they bikes or are they motorcycles? I'm sure motorcycles can't be used on the beach. But those will enhance, right? Certainly enhance public access to the extent that people can get down here easily. On the other hand, they also greatly enhance, in my opinion, the possibility of conflicts because these people down here are one of the reasons they bought here is because they don't want to see anyone on the beach. So that's one kind of impact, the sort of mobility piece that I mentioned earlier. Here's an example I just found today. I never knew there was such a thing as a 248-mile range on a e-bike, but that gives you a sense of really how far people can go. And it's expensive, but it's not incredibly expensive to me. That price includes the extended battery combo. And obviously that's probably we're talking 10 to 15 miles to get to the end of Kiowa. So that's easily within the range. And that would be true in a lot of places, I think, where people could get further than they have before. Another example here, this is actually a little bit further north. Kiowa is south of Charleston. The area north of Charleston, this Sullivan's Island is a little town. Isle of Palms is famous for a variety of reasons, but one of which it's sort of a site of the famous Lucas takings cases, which we talked about in class the other day. But there's a little place up here that I've actually never been. It's a very exclusive private island called Dewey's Island. And I think there's a ferry or a private ferry. There may only be boats that the owners themselves own that they take out there. I'm not really sure. As I said, I've never been there. I know they don't do Airbnb. They're very protective. There's no hotels. They're very protective of the privacy there. It's a very exclusive and expensive place. But of course, just like Kiowa, just like that private gated part of Kiowa, the wet part of the beach on Dewey's Island is public. So if you could figure out a way to get there, and you were able to bring your, let's say, sea kayak or small boat up onto the beach and make sure it didn't go landward of that mean high tide line, you would be entitled to be there. I did find, and I had read about these before, there are all kinds now of relatively affordable, some are more expensive than others. Personal watercraft, not just jet skis, and jet skis would be maybe banned near there because of the noise. But things like this is actually quite pricey, 16,000 bucks. This is known as the Jet Surf Electric 2. I found some less expensive ones. This was just the coolest looking one I found. But these things, which are kind of like powered surfboards, if you will, have pretty good range. And I think, again, you could end up with a situation where you're going to have a lot of people going to the beach at Dewey's. And inevitably, when someone goes to the beach, even if you tell them, you can't be on the dry part of the beach, they're going to go to the dry part of the beach. It always happens. And you're going to end up with some kind of conflict. And again, especially in a place like that where they're just not used to that and they're on an island because they wanted to have no public access. So could increase opportunities. And by the way, there are hundreds of islands like this along the coast of South Carolina and Georgia and North Carolina that will suddenly be, and they're not far, as you saw, right? They're not far from publicly accessible places. Lots more people potentially visiting. I should also mention there's some like national wildlife refuges and things like that that have lots of islands. And so to the extent that you have visitors in there, may or may not be something that the Fish and Wildlife Service is used to dealing with. Okay, I just put this in there. There are also leisure submersibles. I didn't look at the price on these, but that certainly could cause a whole nother range of issues. And I was just kind of curious to learn that these things exist. Private electric submersibles. Okay. I mentioned federal lands. This is an article, I believe it's from one of the outdoor magazines. And, essentially we're having a lot of trouble now figuring out, are these motorcycles, are these bikes? As I said, wilderness areas as a general matter, you can't use mountain bikes. That has been litigated. I'm not sure if that's still always the rule. National Park Service for a long time didn't allow e-bikes, but now they do. They only allow them on some designated trails. But again, I think as more people have them and as the opportunities open up, say to get into the backcountry on these things, there's going to be a lot of pressure to allow people in, which creates conflicts, in this case, not with private landowners, but with other members of the public, quiet recreators, we would call them backpackers and so on, who don't want mountain bikes in the first place. And I'm sure they don't want these e-bikes around either. OnX is an app some of you may have heard of if you're hunters. OnX is basically, and there's similar apps for the beach. I think I'll have a picture of one in a minute. These are on sale for Father's Day. And OnX basically is a way for hunters to find public land that's not otherwise obvious from a map, to find recreational hunting opportunities or fishing opportunities, or maybe just backcountry opportunities. And prior to this, it was very difficult to find these locations. OnX has become famous, or at least famous in my world, because it was really a key factor in a recent decision by the 10th Circuit in a case called Iron Bar Holdings. Not going to go into too much detail on that, but that case is a case from Wyoming where we had a checkerboard land ownership pattern that's a leftover from the transcontinental railroad construction of the transcontinental railroad. The railroads were granted every other square section of land adjacent to the railroad as an incentive to build the railroad. And what that's resulted in is, you can imagine, a chessboard, right, where the red squares are public and the black squares are private, that there are lots of pieces of land in the middle, right, the public squares there's no access to them from another piece of public land unless you go across the corner. You can't cross the private land. And so for a long time, private landowners really essentially privatized those squares, big squares. We're talking about, in the West, 1 million+ acres or millions of acres of public land that was being privatized effectively because there was no public access. And so the surrounding private landowners were using those places to attract hunters at a cost, at a fee. The Iron Bar Holdings case arose because some hunters found some of these squares, or located squares, using onX, and they figured that they could cross onto these public lands by walking across the corner from one corner to the other. The private landowner, Iron Bar Holdings, who owned the two other corners, land on the other two corners, brought a trespassing case, arguing that even though the hunters had never stepped on the private land, right, they just walked across the corner, that obviously their bodies, the hunters' bodies, are wider than 1 pixel or whatever it would be. And so their bodies had gone through the airspace of those adjacent private parcels, and that was a violation of their property rights, and they needed to be arrested for trespass. So in this case, onX is increasing access, but it's also creating conflict. By the way, the 10th Circuit ruled in favor of the hunters, saying that they hadn't actually been on the property, but more importantly, that keeping them off would be a violation of an old federal statute, the Anti-Enclosure Act, among other reasons. But what's interesting also is that when the data was acquired during discovery by the landowners, they were able to track the movements of the hunters, and it turned out that they had done more than simply walk across the corners. They were walking on some of the private land as well. And so that is a separate part of the case, but again, shows how enforcement has changed, access has changed, limits on access have changed in both directions. All right. Again, I mentioned this for the beach as well. There are all kinds of apps. This one is called Our Malibu Beaches. It's the name of the app. There's several other ones like this that do the same thing as onX, essentially try to show you where the beach is public and where it isn't. So we're increasing access, we're increasing conflict, again, here we have errors in the app, I guess, that cause a problem, and so made this landowner very upset, and made him go to court. Also, by the way, I should mention, this is called Flock Safety, this extravagant looking drone. And a lot of this stuff, by the way, is being driven by military technology, of course, advances. Certainly, like the war in Ukraine is producing lots of drone technology advances. And these allow you simply to police many more acres than you used to be able to police at much lower cost. They've got cameras, they've got infrared sensors, they've got loudspeakers where they can talk to the people who are, trespassing. And of course, they've got all kinds of GPS equipment that allow them to detect exactly where they are and therefore where the people are. So again, this is going to probably have a chilling effect on access, I would guess, to the extent that these things appear in the sky and start telling you that you're on private land, even if you're not. I think people will move and go away because it's quite a frightening thing, maybe, and it looks very official and accurate. They could be used for accurate enforcement as well, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I think they will change the nature of enforcement. Airbnb, I mentioned just because it plays an interesting role in all this too. A lot of times we have homeowners who are opposed to beach access, but at the same time, now that we have Airbnb, it's incentivizing more rentals. Those rentals then, no one wants to advertise, please rent my beach house, but you can't go on the beach. Everyone's saying there's beach access. So it's creating more demand. It's creating more expectations of access. It's also bringing people into the picture on the beach who are not familiar to the other landowners there, and so they're going to feel more invaded. They're going to feel like they're more motivated maybe to take some enforcement action. But I also think that's sort of an obvious piece, I guess, of Airbnb is that it's changed the dynamic of landowners versus the public a little bit. But Airbnb or things like that, right, can also be used to enhance access. This is actually from Vermont. I didn't realize you could get this service here, but you can actually, there's sort of Airbnb for trails. So if you own a private trail and rather than selling someone an easement, which would be expensive, and if you were only going to visit once, why would you buy an easement to walk your dog in Vermont? But essentially what you're doing is, right, doing this micro rentals where you can rent out sections of your trails for small periods of time. To the extent that these private trails lead to hard to get to public lands, that may increase access. It may also increase conflict. And you can imagine a world in the future, right, where people are trying harder to privatize trails in order to profit from this business, right? That's what Airbnb has kind of done, is it's sort of created a lot of incentives for people to monetize real property interests. I think that's the end of my slideshow. About perfect, I guess. 11:35. And like I said, I'm happy to answer any questions you have. This is something I really just started looking into, and I haven't really thought through all of the possibilities. But I think all of these, and I'm sure there are many more I don't even know about, technological advancements in terms of expanding the range that people can travel, expanding their knowledge of the public land base, and on the one hand, enhancing access, then on the other side, making it easier for people to enforce trespassing or threaten to enforce trespassing may decrease access. So these are all things I didn't know about when I was wandering around on the public lands for many, many years. And so to me, it's kind of intriguing.
Well, thank you for that overview of what is clearly an emerging area and developing fast, for sure. We have a few minutes to ask some questions from the audience. And as I mentioned, you can sort of, if you're one of the more than 30 folks watching online live, please share your questions in the chat on the right-hand side of the page on YouTube, and I'll monitor those for you, Professor Eagle. So
Thank you.
I'll bring them into the discussion.
Okay.
But I'll start off with a question of my own, which is, as sort of a scholar in this area, what are your sort of observations of the law's reaction to some of these developments? I think in particular of sort of you mentioned e-bikes and sort of the fine grain. We're going to allow class 1 or class 2 or whatever the case may be. And how does the law sort of engage with that question? Is it happening at a regulatory level? Is it happening at a state legislature type level? What have you been seeing?
I have to say I'm not totally familiar with all of that. Honestly, a lot of this is new to me. I've obviously followed cases involving motorized use, like off-road motorized use in national seashores is quite a problem with bird conflicts and also non-motorized recreators. I mentioned the wilderness areas and the questions about what constitutes motorized recreation. Is a bike motorized recreation? Because it's human powered, but then an e-bike is different, right? It's not a motorcycle, and it is partially human, depending on what class it is. It is partially human powered. So you could imagine possibly some legislative changes. Like I said, the Park Service has changed their regulations, and for good reason, right? In some cases, because one of the purposes of the national parks and one of their kind of driving one of their motivations is to increase access, especially for people who would otherwise find it hard to get into some of these areas. And so, that was a justification that was often used, for example, to allow more snowmobiles into Yellowstone, in the wintertime, right? Because some people simply can't walk or are not in condition to get there on cross-country skis. And so I think there's going to always be pressure. Now, whether, there's not going to be a test for, can you get in there without a motorized vehicle? I don't think we're going to do that. So I think what's going to happen is we're just going to see an expansion of opportunities. And I should mention also, if you look at those cases, the cases involving, for example, off-road vehicle use, ATV use, or snowmobile use, or jet ski. I didn't mention jet skis, but jet skis, right, are electric jet skis are much quieter, which can maybe lead towards more access. Almost all of the litigation pushing in the past for increased motorized vehicle use comes from the industry itself, not from the users, because they have the money. And so I think, and that's been effective. So I think you'll see now that there's more money and more manufacturers, you're going to see more pressure.
Terrific. We'll keep an eye on that. I have a couple questions in the chat for you. Melissa asks, what are your thoughts on how sustainability may be impacted by public land access changing with technology? Is this a a set of developments that really benefits environmental protection and sustainability issues, or is it more of a mixed bag, or is it decidedly negative?
I mean, I think it's a mixed bag, and I guess on the argument for that it would enhance, I wouldn't say conservation, but maybe sustainability is that, to the extent that more people get out and see things and start to value these natural areas that they didn't otherwise have access to, I think that increases their political energy to support those places. So, the more people we have interested in public lands, the better, I think, generally speaking. On the other hand, there are lots and lots of studies that document the impact of even hiking on wildlife. Many species of wildlife do not care for trails or any noises or strange noises. Trails create space for predators. You have to cross the space if you're a small bird, for example, and that leaves you vulnerable. And so to the extent that we have, more access, that means more remote areas are going to be experiencing those types of impacts. Maybe there were trails there before, but they weren't being used very frequently. So there's definitely the potential for more disturbance of wildlife. That's what we've seen with ATVs and so on, and snowmobiles. So there's a lot more potential for that. There may be, I mean, one of the kind of I've seen some articles that should say that the demand for non-motorized trails has been increasing due to this type of thing. In other words, the more there are these e-bikes and off-road vehicles, the more that the non-motorized recreators feel like they need their own place. And so they're pushing the Forest Service and they're pushing the BLM and so on to create dedicated non-motorized areas. So that could be good, possibly. So I think we don't know exactly, because again, I mean, I never would have thought that there are, a few years ago, we would not know about these, inexpensive ways to get deep into some of these places or to reach beaches that are on private islands and all kinds of things. So we don't really know exactly what the impacts will be. I'd say it's a mixed bag.
That sounds fair. I mean, the thing that occurs to me is that there is a interesting set of questions about whether I would say the general opposition to motorized vehicles in natural areas changes somewhat as we get more battery operated equipment, which is cleaner, obviously doesn't have some of the same pollution impacts, is quieter. You mentioned that with the jet skis, and thinking how, yeah, the whole world of jet ski litigation might be different if there wasn't a noise attached to the jet ski. But yeah, no, it seems like there's some benefits there, but also that increased access creates a whole nother universe of conflict. The next question in the chat is more if you're a student in this area, do you have any recommendations of, sort of historical periods or specific cases, that might be useful to explore this issue in more depth?
Um, well, I think obviously a lot of this is happening now. I guess we had you could, I don't know how analogous it is. Certainly, the automobile changed the way that public lands are managed, certainly changed the way national parks were managed, because that was became the way to get there and certainly vastly increased visitorship, in the 1940s and I guess 50s. Um, so there's that. But like I said, there are a number of cases coming out now. Like I said, the Iron Bar Holdings. There's also another case I didn't mention in Colorado, where essentially where landowners are trying now to shut off stream access for fishermen. Um, Again, that's new due to the possible enforcement possibilities as well as sort of boundary marking enforceability, which wasn't really there before. Notice to trespassers is a big thing in criminal cases, and so the possibility of giving notice everywhere, like through drone warnings and things like that. So I think really I mean, if I were, and when I was putting this together, I was thinking, oh wow, like what papers would you write about this? I think there are a lot, because you would look to see, here are all the impacts, here are all the places that are going to be impacted, here are all the conflicts that are likely to occur, and then what do you suggest in terms of trying to, preempt those conflicts or resolve them if they're already occurring?
Terrific. One other question that I had was about how these sorts of access issues, and what kind of technology do we allow, and how do we manage the potential for conflict as well as benefits? What governance of these areas, what governance structures, um, might be well suited for handling this problem? Seems like, in management of public lands and public resources, we've had a variety of different approaches to that in our country that vary state by state, federal, state, local, state. And as we think about this particular challenge and this particular issue, are there any that come to mind, governance structures that come to mind that would be more useful or less useful for this?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think first there's just the big policy questions of, what are we trying to do
Yeah.
with our wilderness areas that's going to fit, wilderness areas, for example, like what fits with our policies. But for the most part, the tool that we've used in the past is a kind of a zoning approach, right, where we essentially dedicate certain areas to certain uses, when we're talking about multiple use lands, or even park lands. That's really the key. I mean, those are relatively easy to enforce. If you're trying to enforce, like, for example, as you mentioned earlier, like you can use a class A or whatever the different classes are of e-bikes. You can use this class here, but not here. That's tough, right? Because you have to then stop people and see what kind of bike they're riding. Whereas if you just kind of ban people from particular areas, that it's easier. If they're there, they're there. And if they're not, they're not. Um, I think the problem that you're going to face, like I said, is, on the legislative level, certainly, and in the courts, is that, the money is on the side of more equipment being used and being sold. So, that zoning, all those zoning determinations are made through the planning process, the forest planning process and the BLM FLIPMA process. So I think it'd be important for people to get involved there, to try to make sure they get their fair slice. So I'd say zoning, and then a lot of just policy thinking about kind of given that we have all these new uses, that have varying degrees of impact and different kinds of impacts than we're used to. What do we do with that? Do we really care about that? Or is it, again, there is a benefit to getting people outside, no matter how they do it, whether it's from physical fitness perspective, a mental health perspective, or even, like I said, a passion for public land perspective.
Mhm. Another great question from Melissa in the chat. What are your thoughts on the environmental justice ramifications of this issue for those that may live in rural areas that are now more accessible? Um, is there conversation about how to kind of support these areas that, may be on the one hand, receiving more economic impacts, but on the other hand, receiving more hot, sort of higher income visitation, and how the justice issues sort of play out there.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say, again, you're going to have access conflicts. It is true in the West, over the last 30 years or so, that's what you've seen with just generalized backcountry use is, different demographic, but also a lot of economic opportunities for people who live there. Um, so I think both things are true. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know exactly how it's going to play out. And especially, as the price of these things, like I said, I was shocked, when I look at e-bikes, maybe I don't look at them. I don't have one, but when I look at the prices in the bike stores, it seems like they're like $5,000, but now you can get, for 2,000, you get one with 250 miles of range. I mean, that's as much as a car, right? So, I don't know. Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know how it's going to play out. Hopefully there'll be economic opportunities in there, and there also will be, you're going to have to figure out a way to divide up access differently, so that, right, everybody has a shot, but that, and no one gets squeezed out.
Um, Question from Lucia in the chat. What about sort of private properties that have been historically accessed and used by the public? And that sort of question of private property and how this intersects strikes me as a really rich topic too, because we have a lot of private property areas, as you were sort of alluding to in your talk, that received a certain amount of access, or a certain amount of, maybe there's a footpath through that private property. The public used it, sparingly, and
Mhm.
now there's, a lot more intensive opportunities, say, e-mountain bikes or otherwise, that really open up those areas to, day users of that property. Um, so yeah, I'm wondering what you think about the private,
Yeah.
management of private properties.
Yeah, well, number one, like I said, I think, it could be advantageous or not advantageous. I mean, like I said, the micro rental field is new, and, it gives you a way to control and kind of monetize it to the extent that that's attractive to you. And it also gives you I think, a better justification in some ways for excluding people, because you can, right, it's now a business, allowing people on there or not.
Yeah.
Um, so there's that. I think enforcement is going to be a lot easier. And so if you have large pieces of land, or, you're worried about people coming off the trail onto the private property, then that certainly, hopefully, the technology might, help you there. But I think, like I said, I think there are going to be a lot of places where land has been de facto private because it's so hard to get to, where there's just going to be a shock to the system, where all of a sudden now, like you said, private property owners are going to be faced with a lot more people and a lot more activity. And that's going to be shocking. So they're going to have to figure out, do they take legal steps to exclude them? Do they, like I said, try to monetize the situation, and get something out of it? And through doing that, you could also like limit access. Um, yeah, I'm not really sure. But like I said, I think there are a lot of really interesting issues in here, for somebody to dig into.
And I think we have time for one more question that probably goes to this, um, the one of the more eye-opening parts of what you described was the fact that drones are kind of available to police these properties that historically have not been very easy for landowners to police. Vast hundreds of acres with a
Mhm.
drone, you can have a drone patrol that for very, very low cost,
Mhm.
in a way that was just not possible several years ago.
Mhm.
Um, but in the spirit of going to the air, our own Courtney Collins asks, "What are your thoughts on what may happen to access or rights to the sky? Are there private no-fly zones for drones, for example, and how does that play out?"
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I think that probably has come up a lot in the past, right? With these delivery drones and the other kinds of their law enforcement already uses these a lot. Like I know in the UK where I was, they use them all over the place for just policing towns, regular ordinary crime. And they have an incredible advantage. They're like, they talk to you, they actually follow you around and they have a policeman attached to the other end who's telling you to get out of there. So, so they're quite effective. I think they can be now in terms of whether you can ban them from, if it's a trespass for them to go over your property. That's a new area. I'm sure there's been a lot thought about and written that obviously, we created rules a long time ago that allow airplane overflights because they're so high up and that area is not really usable by the landowner. But, when you're talking about, 40 feet above the trees, that seems like that's pretty close. So, yeah, I don't know the answer to that. But I'm sure we will have rules on that at some point soon.
Yeah, rich area where the technology in a lot of these areas is moving faster than the laws and regulations, and just, an observation, I don't know if you agree with this, is that it is challenging, especially if we think about federal public lands, to not have a very functional Congress that's doing legislation on public lands routinely. And we're sort of left with the agencies to work through these questions in a regulatory process that can be hard to access and also, subject to challenge in court and all these sorts of questions that we may not have as much guidance on a legislative level for some of these changing technologies as we might like in a very functional sort of public lands management sort of governance structure from a federal level.
Yeah, I think that's completely true. And I think what I would say about that is that, historically what we've seen is that in the multiple use context, we're talking about multiple use lands, that the extractors or wherever the money is, that's really what gets the most opportunities on those lands. Whereas Congress's role has generally been the opposite, which is by statute to create things like wilderness areas to protect what I would call like weak interest, like non-motorized recreators and wildlife don't have a lot of money to spend on lobbying. And so, they get these kind of long-term permanent protections that are very clear. But the multiple use areas, which make up the vast bulk of our federal lands, those processes generally are tilted the other direction. So if Congress isn't operating, that means you're only going to get the administrative processes, which, as I said, haven't been very favorable to the weaker interests. I mean, if you represent a non-motorized recreation group, it's very expensive to participate in these processes every day. It's a lot cheaper to, if you could do it, to go to Congress for a couple of years and get something passed, rather than having to go every day for the next 20 years. So, yeah, so I think the Congress being frozen will handicap the interest with less money, would be my guess.
And we certainly have seen that in the wilderness designation area for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I do have one last question, and we have 2 minutes left. So this is maybe a quick lightning final question for you. Where coastal states have expanded the public trust, for example, to include wildlife, might states have obligations to those species, for example, crustaceans, that are dependent or occurrent in those sort of submerged lands? So that's kind of an interesting overlap with this question, but
yeah, well, I mean, obviously, there's a question about that always, that essentially the public trust doctrine, well, it depends on where you are, and it depends on how you read it. But, for the most part, it guarantees fishing access, and it's not clear in every state that means meaningful fishing access. So in other words, that the state has a separate obligation to manage those species. It just means you can go in there and fish. But obviously in states like California, there's cases that say that the state has an obligation to maintain the environmental quality in trust areas. Yeah, I think that's a real question. Again, to the extent that this access has an impact on wildlife, who's going to step up and manage that? Because it's not, this isn't the classic like hunting and fishing, right? It's something else that's affecting them. in a way that we don't really know how to manage as well.
Well, that's terrific. Very, very interesting discussion today, Professor Eagle. We're out of time, so we'll wrap things up. Uh, Thanks to everyone who joined us live today and those of you watching later. Our next talk will take place online this Thursday. Please join us then at the same time at 12 noon Eastern. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thanks so much.
Mhm.